Mar-a-Lago, Palm Beach, February 1973. Marjorie Merriweather Post sits for breakfast in a dining room, built to seat 40. The table stretches before her, set with gold-rimmed china she collected in Moscow decades earlier. She eats alone. Through the windows, the Atlantic moves indifferently beyond manicured lawns that cost more to maintain each month than most Americans earn in a year. She is 86 years old. The staff knows to keep distant unless summoned. Outside the gates, Palm Beach society continues without her. Luncheons, galas, committee meetings to which invitations no longer arrive. She built this house in 1927 to prove she belonged. It proved something else entirely. This is not a story about how a woman conquered American high society through wealth and determination. It is a story about what happened instead. Marjorie Merriweather Post inherited one of the largest fortunes in America before she turned 30. She married 4 times. She built palaces. She entertained ambassadors and presidents. She collected Fabergé eggs and Sèvres porcelain and imperial Russian chalices. She donated a warship to the Navy. She lived inside luxury so complete it required a staff of 70 to maintain. And yet the essential things, acceptance, intimacy, purpose beyond acquisition, remained perpetually out of reach, no matter how much she spent pursuing them. The darkness in this story does not arrive suddenly. It was there from the beginning, in the specific shape her father's fortune took, in the social world that smiled at her wealth while closing ranks against her name, in the marriages that functioned as mergers, in the children who grew to resent what she represented. What follows is not a fall from grace. It is a slow recognition of what was never there to begin with. She was born in 1887 in Springfield, Illinois, before the money arrived. Springfield. Illinois offered Marjorie nothing that suggested the future waiting for her. Her father, Charles William Post, sold farm equipment and barely managed that. He suffered from what doctors called nervous exhaustion, prolonged periods when he could not work, could not sleep, retreated into silence that frightened his daughter. Ella, Marjorie's mother, maintained appearances through these episodes with a determination Marjorie would later recognize in herself. The family was not poor, but they were not secure. C.W. disappeared for months at a time, seeking cures at sanitariums, leaving his wife to explain his absence. In 1891, when Marjorie was 4, her father traveled to Battle Creek, Michigan, seeking treatment at John Harvey Kellogg's sanitarium. He arrived desperate. The Battle Creek method emphasized bland, grain-based foods, hydrotherapy, and the elimination of stimulants. C.W. spent 9 months there. The treatment failed to cure his depression, but it gave him something else, an idea about selling health through breakfast cereal. He left Battle Creek, rented a barn, and began manufacturing a coffee substitute made from roasted wheat and molasses. He called it Postum. Marjorie was 7 when her father's first product began to sell. The advertising was relentless and strange. C.W. wrote copy that blamed coffee for divorce, crime, and moral decay. Postum cured everything according to the ads: nervousness, insomnia, heart palpitations, failing marriages. The claims were absurd. They worked. Orders arrived faster than the barn could fulfill them. Within 2 years, C.W. Post was manufacturing grape nuts, a cereal so hard it required soaking. He advertised that it cured appendicitis and loose teeth. By 1900, he was producing a cereal called Post Toasties. The Postum Cereal Company grew into an empire built entirely on the American willingness to believe that breakfast could solve deeper problems. The money changed everything except C.W.'s mental state. The family moved into a mansion in Battle Creek. Marjorie attended private schools. Her father remained volatile, energetic and visionary one month, unreachable the next. He built a utopian community for his workers, then fought their attempts to unionize with vicious determination. He funded schools and hospitals while paying factory wages low enough that workers could barely afford the products they manufactured. Marjorie watched this. She learned that wealth purchased goodwill through donation, that generosity could coexist with exploitation, that contradictions dissolved if the checks were large enough. In 1904, C.W. decided Battle Creek was too small for his ambitions. He moved the family to Greenwich, Connecticut, and later to Washington, D.C. Marjorie was 17, educated in private schools, fluent in French, trained in piano and deportment. She understood that she was being prepared for something. Her father made clear she would inherit everything. There were no sons. The Postum Cereal Company would pass to her. This was presented as opportunity, but it functioned as assignment. Her life was determined before she had the chance to imagine alternatives. C.W. began to withdraw again in 1907. The episodes grew longer. He obsessed over perceived enemies, competitors, journalists, former employees. He built a mansion in Santa Barbara and spent months there, away from the business, surrounded by staff who monitored his moods. Marjorie visited him there when summoned. The house was palatial and silent. Her father spoke about threats that did not exist, about conspiracies, about the burden of what he had built. She tried to comfort him. He responded to her the way he responded to everyone, with suspicion, then dismissal, then long periods of refusing to speak at all. The Postum Company continued to expand despite C.W.'s deterioration. Professional managers ran operations. The advertising never stopped. Marjorie turned 21 in 1908, legally an adult but functionally held in waiting. Her father controlled everything. She could not marry without his approval, could not make decisions about her own money, could not exist outside the structure he had created. This was not unusual for wealthy daughters of that era, but the specific weight was heavier because there was no one else. No brothers to share the burden, no cousins positioned as alternatives, just Marjorie and the cereal fortune, and her father's increasingly unstable grip on both. She was being trained, though the training was informal and incomplete. C.W. brought her to board meetings occasionally, introduced her to company executives, explained the basics of operations, but he never spoke about what to do when the person controlling everything could no longer be trusted to control himself. He never explained how to manage a fortune built on advertising promises that were provably false. He never acknowledged that the Postum Cereal Company's success depended on manipulating customers into believing that trauma, illness, and unhappiness could be cured by changing what they ate for breakfast. Marjorie learned by watching. She learned that presentation mattered more than truth. She learned that charity and exploitation could exist simultaneously without contradiction, as long as the charity was visible and the exploitation was not. She learned that mental illness was something to be hidden, managed through geographic distance and the loyalty of paid staff. She learned that wealth created a kind of aloneness. Her father, despite his success, had no friends, only employees and dependents. By 1910, Marjorie was 23 and still unmarried. This was becoming a problem. Wealthy daughters were expected to marry by 21, 22 at the latest, but C.W. rejected every potential suitor. Too ambitious, too poor, wrong family, wrong intentions. He wanted control over who would eventually have access to his fortune, but he could not articulate what qualified as acceptable. Marjorie waited. She lived in the Washington mansion, attended events, performed the role of dutiful daughter. She smiled at dinner parties and said nothing of substance, and watched her father descend further into paranoia. The pressure was not discussed openly, but it saturated everything. Marjorie would inherit an empire. Marjorie would marry someone appropriate. Marjorie would continue the Post name and the Post fortune. These were not possibilities. They were requirements. And beneath them, unspoken but understood, was the knowledge that her father's mind was failing, that the man who built everything was becoming the man who could destroy it, and that she was being positioned to catch the fortune when he could no longer hold it himself. She had no choice in any of this. The weight was already hers. Edward Bennett Close was 27 when he began courting Marjorie in 1904. He came from money, though not fortune. His family owned a successful law practice in Greenwich, Connecticut. He was handsome in the unremarkable way that wealthy men of that era were handsome, clean-shaven, well-tailored, appropriate. C.W. Post approved of him primarily because Edward posed no threat. He had his own income. He showed no interest in the cereal business. He was Protestant, educated, socially acceptable. The courtship proceeded with C.W.'s permission, which meant it proceeded under C.W.'s supervision. They married in 1905. Marjorie was 18. The wedding took place at the Post Mansion in Washington, attended by business associates and carefully selected society figures. It was an expensive event, extensively photographed, and utterly joyless in the way that transactional marriages often are. Edward gained access to wealth. Marjorie gained permission to leave her father's house. Neither gained a partner. The marriage was an arrangement that satisfied the social requirement for wealthy daughters to marry young, and it satisfied C.W.'s need to maintain control over his daughter while appearing to release her. Edward and Marjorie moved to Greenwich. C.W. purchased them a house, large, tasteful, within visiting distance. Marjorie decorated it according to the standards she had absorbed from her mother: expensive but not ostentatious, traditional, designed to signal respectability. She was playing at domesticity. She had no meaningful role in her husband's life beyond the social one. Edward practiced law. Marjorie attended luncheons, organized small dinner parties, and waited for invitations that arrived slowly, if at all. Greenwich society in 1905 operated on bloodline and longevity. The families who mattered had been there for generations. They had inherited their wealth, or they had married into it decades earlier, and they had established themselves before the rules solidified. The Posts were new. C.W. had made his money in cereal, which was barely removed from manufacturing, which was barely removed from trade. Old money did not work in factories, even factories they owned. Old money inherited investments. The distinction mattered absolutely. Marjorie received courtesy invitations to certain events: charity committees, hospital fundraisers, church functions, where her father's donations made exclusion impossible. But the private gatherings, the intimate luncheons, the tennis parties, the sailing weekends, these happened without her. She learned about them afterward. Women she had tried to befriend would mention casually that they had just returned from a weekend in Newport, and the guest list would include everyone except Marjorie. The message was clear. Her money granted access to public society. It did not grant acceptance into private circles. She responded by trying harder. She donated more. She served on more committees. She hosted dinners and invited the right people, who attended out of politeness and left early. She dressed impeccably. She studied the social codes and followed them precisely. None of it worked. The harder she tried, the more obvious her desperation became, and desperation was the one thing old money could not forgive. It revealed that you needed them. It showed you understood you were on the outside. Edward noticed none of this, or pretended not to. He had his own social life, his law practice, his clubs that admitted him without question, because his family had been members for generations. He came home for dinner, reviewed his cases, and retired early. The marriage functioned as cohabitation between polite strangers. They had 2 daughters, Adelaide in 1908, Eleanor in 1909. Marjorie performed motherhood the way she performed everything else: correctly, expensively, without warmth. Nurses handled the actual care. Marjorie appeared at appropriate intervals, supervised from a distance, and focused her energy on the problem that consumed her. Social acceptance. In 1910, she attempted to join the Greenwich Garden Club. This was not a casual organization. Membership required nomination, seconding, and approval by the existing members. Marjorie secured a nomination from a woman whose hospital wing her father had funded. The vote was held. She was rejected. No explanation was provided. None was needed. The Garden Club did not want her, and the Garden Club did not need to justify its decisions to anyone, least of all to a serial heiress who had been married for 5 years, and still did not understand that certain doors would never open. The rejection should have ended her attempts. It intensified them instead. Marjorie began hosting larger events. She hired the best caterers, brought in musicians, sent invitations to everyone who mattered in Greenwich. Attendance was moderate. People came because the food was excellent and the setting was impressive. They did not come because they wanted to know Marjorie. She stood in her own drawing room, surrounded by guests, and understood that she was still alone. The conversation stopped when she approached. Women smiled and complimented her house and moved away to talk to each other. She was the hostess, which meant she was the help. Edward found this embarrassing. He came from a family that was accepted, and his wife's social failures reflected on him. He began spending more time at his club, more weekends away. The marriage, which had never been intimate, became purely functional. They lived in the same house. They appeared together at required events. They barely spoke. Marjorie focused on her daughters, though focused meant hiring better nurses, enrolling them in the right schools, planning their futures the way her father had planned hers. She was replicating the only model she knew. By 1914, Marjorie had spent 9 years in Greenwich and gained nothing except the knowledge that money could not purchase what she wanted most. Her father's fortune had bought the house, the staff, the wardrobe, the invitations to public events. It had not bought friendship. It had not bought belonging. It had not bought respect from women who had less money but better names. She was 27 years old, married to a man who avoided her, raising daughters with the help of hired staff, and trapped inside a social system that had evaluated her and found her permanently insufficient. C.W.'s mental state continued to deteriorate. He moved between his properties, Washington, Santa Barbara, Battle Creek, pursued by doctors who could do nothing. The Postum Cereal Company continued to grow. Marjorie received updates about the business from company executives, but she had no authority, no role beyond eventual inheritance. She was waiting for her father to die. This was not something anyone said aloud, but it was the reality. Her life would begin when his ended. Until then, she performed her assigned roles: daughter, wife, mother, rejected socialite. And the performance grew heavier with each year. C.W. Post shot himself on May 9th, 1914, in his bedroom at his Santa Barbara estate. He used a revolver. Staff found him shortly after. He was 59 years old. The official cause of death, reported in newspapers, was complications from appendicitis surgery. This was a lie that everyone accepted because suicide carried stigma that wealth preferred to avoid. Marjorie knew the truth. She had visited him 2 months earlier and seen the deterioration, the paranoia, the refusal to eat, the certainty that enemies were poisoning him. She had left Santa Barbara knowing her father was dying, though not knowing he would choose the timing himself. She was 27. The Postum Cereal Company passed to her immediately, along with everything else: the houses, the land holdings, the investment portfolios, the art collection, the obligations. The fortune was estimated at $20 million, equivalent to roughly $500 million in later currency. She became one of the wealthiest women in America overnight. The inheritance arrived with no preparation beyond the informal observations she had made during her father's life. There was no transition period, no apprenticeship, no time to learn. The board of directors met with her 3 days after the funeral. The meeting took place in Battle Creek. Marjorie sat at the head of a table surrounded by men who had worked with her father for years. They were polite. They called her Mrs. Close. They explained the company's operations, its current expansion plans, its position in the cereal market. Then they explained what they expected from her: approval of their decisions, attendance at annual meetings, public appearances when necessary. They did not expect her to manage anything. They expected her to inherit correctly, which meant staying out of the way while they continued running the business that generated her wealth. Marjorie understood this was not a negotiation. She was the owner, but ownership without knowledge was ceremonial. These men knew production, distribution, advertising, labor relations. She knew nothing except that cereal had made her rich. She could have insisted on involvement, demanded to learn the business, fought for actual control. She did not. She approved their plans. She attended the meetings. She signed what they put in front of her. This was partly pragmatism. She had no basis for challenging them, but it was also continuation of a pattern established in childhood. Wealth was something that happened to you, not something you directed. The Postum Cereal Company continued exactly as before. The advertising remained aggressive and dishonest. Grape Nuts still claimed to cure appendicitis. Postum still promised to save marriages that coffee had destroyed. The workers still earned wages that barely sustained them, while the profits increased. Marjorie received quarterly reports. The numbers grew. Her wealth expanded independent of any action she took. She was not building anything. She was receiving the proceeds of what her father built, and what the company executives maintained, and what the advertising department sold to Americans who believed breakfast cereal could solve problems that had nothing to do with breakfast. Edward Close found the inheritance clarifying. He was now married to one of the wealthiest women in America, which changed his social position considerably. His own family money, which had seemed adequate before, now appeared insignificant. The dynamic between them shifted. He had never loved Marjorie, but he had not resented her either. Now he resented her. She had done nothing to earn this fortune. She had simply been born to the right father at the right moment. Edward practiced law because he needed to work. Marjorie would never need to work. The injustice of this, that she had everything while doing nothing, poisoned what little remained of their marriage. They stayed together. Divorce in 1914 was scandalous, expensive, and complicated when significant wealth was involved. They maintained separate lives within the same household. Edward took trips without her. Marjorie focused on her daughters and her continued futile attempts to gain social acceptance in Greenwich. The fortune changed nothing about how society viewed her. She was still new money. She was still the serial heiress. She was now the serial heiress without even the father who built the fortune. She was inherited wealth, which was somehow worse than earned wealth in the social calculus that mattered to her. In 1915, Marjorie made her first major financial decision. She purchased a winter home in Palm Beach, Florida. The house was large but not extraordinary, a Spanish-style villa on Ocean Boulevard. She bought it because Palm Beach society was newer than Greenwich, less calcified, potentially more welcoming. She spent that winter there with her daughters, escaping the Connecticut cold and the Connecticut social structure that had rejected her. Palm Beach was different, but not in the ways she hoped. The old families there were simply different old families. They had arrived in the 1890s instead of the 1790s. They still did not want her. The war in Europe expanded throughout 1915 and 1916. American newspapers covered it extensively. Marjorie read about the fighting, the casualties, the destruction. She made donations to relief organizations. She attended fundraisers for Belgian refugees, for wounded soldiers, for war orphans. The donations were large enough to earn public recognition, small enough to be completely unnoticed by her overall fortune. This was how wealth worked. She could give away thousands and never feel the loss. The giving meant nothing to her financial position. It purchased goodwill, social credit, the appearance of conscience. It did not require sacrifice. Adelaide and Eleanor grew older, 7 and 6 in 1915. They attended private schools. They had tutors for French and piano. They had nurses and governesses. They saw their mother at scheduled times. Marjorie was replicating her own childhood, creating the same emotional distance she had experienced with her own parents. She did not do this deliberately. She did it because it was the only model she knew. Wealthy children were raised by staff. Mothers supervised from a distance. Affection was scheduled and supervised. This was normal. This was correct. The fact that it produced lonely children who would grow into resentful adults was not yet visible. By 1917, Marjorie had been in control of the Postum fortune for 3 years. The company had grown. Her wealth had increased. She lived in multiple houses. She employed dozens of staff. She had everything her father's money could purchase. She had not gained social acceptance. She had not found purpose beyond managing inherited wealth. She had not built anything herself. She existed as the custodian of someone else's achievement, and that role was proving insufficient in ways she could not yet articulate. The money solved nothing except the problem of not having money. Every other problem remained, unsolved and growing. Edward Francis Hutton was a self-made man, which mattered to him considerably. He had built E.F. Hutton and Company from nothing into one of the most successful brokerage firms on Wall Street. He understood money as a tool, as leverage, as something to be actively managed. When he met Marjorie in 1919, he saw immediately what she did not, that she was sitting on a fortune she barely controlled, generating wealth she did not manage, and married to a man who contributed nothing to any of it. They met at a dinner party in New York. Edward Close was there, increasingly absent from Marjorie's life, but still technically her husband. E.F. Hutton paid attention to Marjorie in a way Edward had not in years. He asked about the Postum Company. He asked intelligent questions about operations, about expansion, about competition in the cereal market. He treated her as someone who might have answers, even though they both knew she did not. The attention was intoxicating. She had spent 5 years managing inherited wealth in isolation. Here was someone who wanted to discuss it, who saw opportunity where she saw only obligation. The affair began quietly. E.F. Hutton was married. Marjorie was married. They met in New York, away from Greenwich, away from scrutiny. The relationship was not romantic in any conventional sense. It was transactional from the beginning. E.F. wanted access to her fortune. Marjorie wanted someone who made her feel competent, who treated her wealth as something to be deployed rather than simply maintained. They were using each other, but the terms were unspoken and therefore deniable. By 1920, both marriages were ending. Edward Close agreed to a divorce in exchange for a financial settlement that was generous enough to ensure his cooperation and his silence. E.F. Hutton's wife proved more difficult. She understood exactly what was happening and wanted compensation that reflected the actual value of what she was losing. The divorce cost E.F. considerably. He married Marjorie in December 1920, 8 months after her divorce was finalized. She was 33, he was 46. The wedding was small, private, designed to avoid the scandal that both divorces had generated. The marriage immediately functioned as a business partnership. E.F. took an active interest in the Postum Cereal Company. He met with the board of directors. He reviewed the financial statements Marjorie had been signing without fully understanding. He saw what she had not, that the company was profitable but poorly managed, expanding without strategy, vulnerable to competition. He pushed for changes. The board resisted. They had been operating independently for years. They did not want direction from the owner's new husband, regardless of his expertise. E.F. approached the problem differently. He could not control the Postum Company directly, but he could control how Marjorie's wealth was invested beyond it. He restructured her portfolio, shifted assets into stocks and bonds he selected, used her capital to make investments that benefited his own firm. This was legal. It was also ethically questionable. He was managing his wife's money in ways that generated fees for his brokerage and opportunities for his clients. Marjorie either did not notice or chose not to. She had married him precisely because he would take control of the finances that overwhelmed her. They built a life that revolved around acquisition. E.F. purchased a mansion in Palm Beach, larger than the house Marjorie had bought in 1915. They renovated it extensively, imported marble, crystal chandeliers, ballrooms designed for hundreds of guests. They bought an apartment in New York overlooking Central Park. They purchased a yacht, the Hussar, fully staffed, large enough to cross the Atlantic. Each acquisition was presented as investment, as asset management, as the intelligent deployment of capital. Each acquisition also served E.F.'s need to display wealth he had earned through marriage rather than inheritance. Marjorie had a daughter with E.F. in 1923, Nedaniah, who would later change her name to Dina Merrill. The pregnancy and birth were managed by the best doctors, in the best hospitals, with every possible intervention money could purchase. Marjorie was 36, older than was typical for childbirth in that era. She recovered slowly. Nurses handled the infant. Marjorie returned to the social obligations that consumed her time: charity events, dinner parties, the exhausting performance of wealth. Adelaide and Eleanor, her daughters from her first marriage, were teenagers now. They attended boarding schools. They came home for holidays. They barely knew their mother. The age gap between them and their new half-sister emphasized the distance. Marjorie had 3 daughters raised by 3 different sets of staff in different houses during different phases of her life. She was not building a family. She was producing heirs, each one evidence of a different marriage, each one raised in isolation from the others. E.F. pushed Marjorie toward more visible philanthropy. He understood that wealth of their scale required public justification. They donated to hospitals, museums, universities. The donations were large enough to earn naming rights: wings, galleries, professorships. Marjorie's name appeared on buildings. The irony was lost on everyone. She was purchasing visibility through generosity, trying to buy the acceptance that private society had denied her. The institutions accepted her money eagerly. The social world that mattered to her remained closed. The marriage was functional, but cold. E.F. traveled frequently for business. Marjorie maintained the houses, organized the staff, attended events. They appeared together when necessary. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives that intersected primarily around financial decisions and social obligations. This was not unusual for wealthy couples of that era. Marriage at that level was about consolidating resources, producing heirs, maintaining social position. Affection was optional. Fidelity was optional. What mattered was the appearance of stability and the proper management of wealth. By 1925, Marjorie had been married to E.F. Hutton for 5 years. The Postum Cereal Company continued to grow. Her wealth had nearly doubled through E.F.'s management, and the general prosperity of the 1920s. She owned multiple estates. She employed over 100 staff across her properties. She had everything except what she wanted. Genuine acceptance, meaningful purpose, relationships that extended beyond transaction. She was 38 years old. She had been wealthy for 11 years. The money had solved nothing except the problem of survival. Everything else, belonging, intimacy, the feeling that her life meant something beyond accumulation, remained impossible to purchase no matter how much she spent trying. Palm Beach in 1924 was where old money went to pretend it was still young. The Vanderbilts had estates there, the Stotesburys, the Wanamakers, the Wideners, families who had been wealthy long enough that no one remembered how they got that way. They spent winters in sprawling Mediterranean villas, attended each other's parties, and maintained the same social hierarchies they enforced in Newport and Philadelphia. Marjorie had been coming to Palm Beach for nearly a decade. She was still an outsider. The rejection operated through silence. Invitations arrived for the large public events where exclusion would be noticed. They did not arrive for the intimate gatherings that mattered. Marjorie learned about these afterward. A luncheon at the Everglades Club, a dinner party at the Phipps estate, a weekend on someone's yacht. The same women who smiled at her during charity events were photographed together in the society pages, at gatherings Marjorie had not known existed until they were already over. The message was consistent. Her money purchased visibility, not belonging. In 1924, E.F. Hutton suggested she build something that would force recognition. Not another house, a statement. Something so large, so magnificent, that Palm Beach society could not ignore it. Marjorie had the land already, 17 acres stretching from Lake Worth to the Atlantic Ocean, the only property in Palm Beach with direct water access on both sides. She hired Marion Sims Wyeth and Joseph Urban, architects who understood that she wanted grandeur that surpassed anything currently standing in Palm Beach. The design took 2 years. Mar-a-Lago would have 128 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms. The architecture combined Spanish, Venetian, and Portuguese influences, a Mediterranean fantasy built for a climate that approximated the Mediterranean without being it. The materials were imported: Dorian stone from Genoa, Spanish tiles from the 1500s, Venetian glass, marble from quarries that had supplied European palaces. The cost was $7 million, equivalent to over $100 million in later currency. Construction began in 1925. Marjorie supervised every detail. She traveled to Europe to purchase antiques that would fill the rooms: tapestries, furniture, chandeliers, entire ceilings purchased from demolished villas. She worked with Urban on the interior design, selecting fabrics, approving paint colors, deciding which rooms would have gold leaf ceilings and which would feature hand-painted tiles. This was not architecture as shelter. This was architecture as argument. She was building proof that she belonged in Palm Beach, constructing evidence of her taste in wealth and sophistication. The construction required 3 years and employed hundreds of workers. They worked through Florida summers, brutal heat, hurricanes. The labor conditions were exactly what you would expect from a 1920s construction project, managed by contractors who prioritized speed and cost over worker safety. Men were injured, some died. These deaths were not recorded in the society pages that breathlessly covered Mar-a-Lago's progress. The workers who built Marjorie's palace remained invisible, mentioned only as labor costs in construction reports. Mar-a-Lago opened in January 1927. Marjorie hosted a party that was extensively photographed and widely covered in newspapers. 500 guests attended. The event was spectacular: orchestras, champagne, caviar, rooms lit by thousands of candles. Palm Beach society came because the house was too magnificent to boycott. They toured the rooms, admired the imported ceilings, examined the antiques, and left. The invitations Marjorie wanted, the intimate luncheons, the small dinner parties, the casual gatherings among friends, still did not arrive. The house did not solve the problem it was built to solve. It proved she could spend $7 million. It proved she could hire excellent architects. It proved she had access to European antiques and rare materials. It did not prove she belonged. If anything, Mar-a-Lago emphasized the difference between Marjorie and the families who mattered in Palm Beach. Old money built tasteful villas. Marjorie built a palace. Old money exercised restraint. Marjorie exercised wealth. The distinction was fatal to her social ambitions. She began spending winters at Mar-a-Lago, attended by a staff of 70. The estate required constant maintenance: gardeners, housekeepers, cooks, maids, chauffeurs, mechanics, groundskeepers. The monthly operating costs exceeded what most families earned in years. Marjorie moved through the 128 rooms, entertaining guests she invited herself, hosting parties that people attended out of obligation or curiosity rather than affection. She sat alone in rooms designed for crowds, surrounded by beauty that required a fortune to maintain and provided nothing except the confirmation that beauty was not enough. E.F. Hutton spent little time at Mar-a-Lago. He preferred New York, where his business was, where his social connections mattered. He came to Palm Beach for occasional weekends, appeared at the major parties Marjorie hosted, and returned to Manhattan as quickly as possible. The marriage, which had always been functional rather than romantic, was now barely even functional. They communicated through lawyers and secretaries. They made financial decisions together. They lived separate lives in separate cities, and met only when appearances required it. Adelaide and Eleanor, Marjorie's older daughters, visited Mar-a-Lago once. They were 19 and 18, enrolled at colleges their mother selected, pursuing lives that had nothing to do with serial fortunes or Palm Beach society. They found the house grotesque. The excess, the staff, the imported antiques from European palaces, all of it struck them as obscene. They stayed 3 days and left early. Marjorie could not understand their reaction. She had built something magnificent. They saw something else, evidence of wealth so extreme it had lost connection to any recognizable human scale. Nedania, Marjorie's daughter with E.F. Hutton, was 4 years old. She was raised by nurses in the Palm Beach house, in the New York apartment, in whichever residence her parents currently occupied. She barely saw her mother. Marjorie was consumed with managing the estate, organizing events, attempting to penetrate social circles that remained permanently closed. The child grew up surrounded by servants, inside palaces, and utterly alone in the way that children of the extremely wealthy often are, physically cared for, emotionally abandoned. By 1928, Mar-a-Lago had been completed for a year. It had not accomplished what Marjorie intended. The house was famous, photographed, admired as architecture. It had not made her famous in the way she wanted, as someone accepted, someone who belonged. She had spent $7 million building evidence of her wealth. The evidence was overwhelming. It persuaded no one of anything except that she was willing to spend extraordinary amounts of money to solve a problem that money could not solve. Joseph Edward Davies was 58 when he met Marjorie in 1935. He had been married twice before. He practiced law in Washington, handled corporate cases, and maintained political connections through the Democratic Party. He wanted an ambassadorship. He had wanted one for years. Appointments like that required money, personal wealth that could subsidize diplomatic entertaining, or access to someone else's wealth who could be convinced to subsidize it. When he met Marjorie at a Washington dinner party, he saw the solution to his problem. Marjorie was 48 and recently divorced. Her marriage to E.F. Hutton had ended in 1935 after 15 years of increasing distance and mutual indifference. The divorce was expensive but efficient. E.F. kept his brokerage firm. Marjorie kept everything else. She had 3 daughters who barely knew her, multiple estates she rarely occupied, and wealth that continued to grow regardless of what she did with it. She was lonely in the specific way that wealthy divorced women are lonely, surrounded by staff invited to events and utterly without intimacy. Davies courted her with political conversation. He talked about Roosevelt's New Deal, about international relations, about the importance of American diplomacy in an increasingly unstable world. He treated her as someone whose opinions mattered, which almost no one did. He suggested that her wealth could serve larger purposes, that she could be more than a serial heiress, more than a woman who built houses and hosted parties. He offered her significance. She wanted that more than she had wanted anything in years. They married in December 1935, less than a year after her divorce was finalized. The wedding was private, held at Mar-a-Lago, attended by family and political connections. Davies moved into her houses, Mar-a-Lago, the New York apartment, a new estate she had purchased in Washington called Tregorin. He brought his 2 daughters from his previous marriages. Marjorie had her 3 daughters. The combined family met for holidays and formal dinners and existed in uncomfortable proximity. These children of various broken marriages assembled around tables in houses that belonged to Marjorie, but were now occupied by Davies's ambitions. Davies wanted the ambassadorship to the Soviet Union. This was not a prestigious post in 1936. The USSR was diplomatically isolated, ideologically hostile, and recently emerged from famines that had killed millions. Most career diplomats avoided Moscow. Davies wanted it anyway. He believed it would position him for higher appointments later. He lobbied Roosevelt directly. He donated to the Democratic Party. He made clear that he could fund diplomatic entertaining on a scale the State Department budget could never match. Roosevelt appointed him in November 1936. Marjorie funded everything. The State Department provided minimal support for ambassadors, a salary, an official residence, basic staff. Everything else, the receptions, the dinners, the gifts for Soviet officials, the travel, the entertaining that was essential to diplomatic work, came from personal funds. Most ambassadors struggled with these costs. Marjorie's wealth made the costs irrelevant. She could host dinners for hundreds without noticing the expense. She could purchase gifts that impressed Soviet officials accustomed to scarcity. She was subsidizing her husband's political career and calling it marriage. They arrived in Moscow in January 1937. The official residence was adequate but not luxurious. Marjorie redecorated immediately, imported furniture, hired additional staff, turned the residence into something that resembled her American estates. She hosted receptions that dazzled Soviet officials with food most Muscovites could not access, alcohol that was scarce, luxury that contrasted absolutely with the conditions outside the embassy walls. The entertaining was diplomatic strategy. It was also grotesque, this display of American wealth in a city where people stood in bread lines. Davies was entranced by Stalin. He attended the show trials of 1937 and 1938, where old Bolsheviks confessed to absurd conspiracies and were sentenced to death. Davies believed the confessions were genuine. He wrote reports to the State Department praising the trials as legitimate justice. He met with Stalin and came away impressed by his pragmatism. He ignored or dismissed the testimony of purge survivors, the evidence of mass executions, the reality of the terror that was consuming the Soviet Union. He saw what he wanted to see, and what he wanted to see was a strong leader managing a difficult transition. Marjorie saw almost none of this. She spoke no Russian. She moved through Moscow in chauffeured cars, attended diplomatic receptions, shopped for Russian antiques and art that Soviet officials were eager to sell for hard currency. She purchased Fabergé eggs, imperial porcelain, icons, jeweled boxes, treasures that had belonged to the Romanovs and the aristocracy, now liquidated by a government that needed foreign currency more than it needed to preserve its own history. Marjorie was acquiring fragments of a destroyed world and shipping them back to her American estates. The conditions outside the embassy were invisible to her. The hunger, the fear, the disappearances, these were not part of her Moscow experience. She attended ballets at the Bolshoi, toured palaces that had been converted into museums, purchased art from state-run shops that offered imperial treasures at prices that seemed absurdly low because the Soviet government was desperate for American dollars. She saw Moscow as a shopping opportunity. She did not see the terror. Davies's reports to Washington praised Soviet intentions and dismissed evidence of atrocities. He was not naive. He was willfully blind. The ambassadorship was the achievement he had wanted, and maintaining it required sending reports that Roosevelt wanted to hear, that the USSR could be a reliable partner, that Stalin was a reasonable leader, that American-Soviet cooperation was possible. Davies believed these things because believing them served his career. Marjorie funded the diplomatic work that allowed him to maintain these delusions. They left Moscow in June 1938, after 18 months. Davies had accomplished what he wanted. The ambassadorship was on his record, his political connections were strengthened, and he had positioned himself for future appointments. Marjorie returned to the United States with crates of Russian treasures, Fabergé eggs, imperial china, jeweled artifacts that had belonged to the Romanovs. She had spent 18 months funding her husband's career and purchasing fragments of a murdered aristocracy. She had witnessed nothing of the actual Soviet Union, The purges, the terror, the suffering. She had been there and seen nothing except what she could buy. The marriage continued, but the purpose had been served. Davies had his ambassadorship. Marjorie had her Russian treasures. They returned to their separate lives in her various estates connected by legal marriage and mutual utility, intimate in no meaningful sense. She had purchased another husband, another role, another attempt at significance. The significance remained as elusive as everything else she had tried to buy. The Postum Cereal Company had grown beyond breakfast by 1929. The board had acquired other brands: Jell-O, Baker's Chocolate, Maxwell House Coffee, Bird's Eye Frozen Foods. The company was no longer just cereal. It was an empire built on convenience, on processed foods that promised to simplify American domestic life. The advertising remained aggressive and often dishonest. The profits remained substantial. Marjorie attended board meetings, signed documents, and collected dividends that increased regardless of her involvement. In 1929, the board proposed a merger. Postum Cereal Company would combine with Clarence Birdseye's frozen food patents and several other food companies to form a new corporation, General Foods. The merger made financial sense. It would create one of the largest food companies in America, diversified enough to survive market fluctuations, powerful enough to control distribution and pricing. The board presented this to Marjorie as inevitable progress. She was the largest shareholder. Her approval was required. Her actual opinion was not. Marjorie understood what the merger meant. The Postum Cereal Company, her father's creation, the source of her wealth, the thing that defined her, would disappear. The name would vanish into a larger corporate structure. She would own shares in General Foods, valuable shares, but she would no longer own the company her father built. She would become one shareholder among many, her control diluted, her connection to the source of her fortune abstracted into percentage points and quarterly dividends. She approved the merger. She had no meaningful alternative. The board had already decided. They needed her signature, not her consent. The merger was completed in 1929. General Foods Corporation was born. Marjorie became the largest individual shareholder, but individual shareholders did not control corporations of that scale. Professional managers did. Boards of directors did. The executives who understood operations and markets and labor relations, they controlled General Foods. Marjorie controlled nothing except the right to receive profits from something she no longer owned in any real sense. The timing was catastrophic. The stock market collapsed in October 1929. General Foods stock plummeted with everything else. Marjorie's paper wealth evaporated by millions. The company itself survived. People still needed to eat, even in a depression. But the value of her shares dropped 40% in weeks. She had approved a merger that transformed her father's company into something she did not control, and immediately afterward the market destroyed a significant portion of what that merger was supposed to protect. The Depression reached its depth by 1932. Unemployment exceeded 25%. Bread lines stretched through cities. Families lost homes, farms, businesses. General Foods continued operating profitably. The company sold cheap, convenient food to people who could no longer afford anything else. Jell-O, Maxwell House, Postum. These were products for people surviving on diminished budgets. The worse the Depression became, the more essential General Foods products were to the American poor. The company's profits stabilized. Marjorie's dividends resumed. She was getting wealthier while the country collapsed. She noticed this only in the abstract. Her daily life changed not at all. She maintained her estates. She employed the same staff. She continued purchasing art and antiques. The Depression was something she read about in newspapers, something visible in the increased requests for charitable donations, something that made fundraising events more urgent. She donated. She served on relief committees. The donations were large by normal standards, negligible compared to her fortune. She gave away what she would never miss and felt she had done something meaningful. Mar-a-Lago required 70 staff to operate. During the Depression's worst years, Marjorie maintained full staff at all her properties. Palm Beach, New York, Washington, Greenwich. These were jobs, she reasoned. She was providing employment. This was true in the most literal sense. It was also true that she was employing people to maintain houses she barely occupied, to serve meals to almost no one, to preserve estates that existed as evidence of wealth rather than as functional residences. The staff worked because they had no alternatives. They polished silver that was never used, cleaned rooms that were never entered, and understood that their employment was an accident of proximity to a fortune that had nothing to do with merit or labor or anything except inheritance. General Foods expanded through the Depression by acquiring struggling competitors. The company purchased brands at bankruptcy prices, absorbed their operations, fired redundant workers, and consolidated production. This was presented as saving American businesses. It was eliminating competition and centralizing control. Marjorie signed off on these acquisitions. They increased her wealth. They also increased unemployment in an economy that already could not provide jobs. The contradiction was never presented to her in terms that required acknowledgement. By 1935, General Foods was the dominant processed food company in America. The brand portfolio was enormous: cereals, coffee, chocolate, frozen foods, desserts, beverages. The advertising budget exceeded what entire companies spent on operations. The company employed thousands, paid them as little as possible, and used efficiency gains from consolidation to maximize profit margins. Marjorie attended annual meetings where executives presented growth projections and acquisition targets. She approved everything. She understood nothing about the actual operations, the factories, the workers, the labor relations, the decisions that generated the dividends she received. She had become completely separated from the source of her wealth. Her father had manufactured cereal. He had worked in the factory, at least initially. He had understood production. Marjorie understood only that General Foods sent dividend checks that maintained her lifestyle. The company could have been manufacturing anything. The product was irrelevant. What mattered was the quarterly payment that arrived, regardless of what she did or did not do. The board of General Foods invited her to events. They asked her to appear at factory openings, at charity functions sponsored by the company, at public relations opportunities where the founder's daughter could provide symbolic connection to the company's origins. She attended these events. She smiled in photographs. She said nothing of substance. The executives tolerated her presence because she was the largest shareholder and because her father's name still appeared in company histories. They did not consult her on strategy. They did not value her opinions. She was useful as symbol, irrelevant as decision-maker. By 1938, Marjorie had been separated from meaningful control of General Foods for nearly a decade. The company had made her wealthier. It had also completed the process her father began, the transformation of her into someone who existed purely as recipient of wealth, without function, without purpose, without any connection to the labor that generated the fortune she spent. She attended board meetings because attending was expected. She collected dividends because that was automatic. She had everything except what her father had, the knowledge that he built something, even if what he built exploited workers and lied to customers. She had not built anything. She had only inherited and spent. The war arrived slowly for Marjorie, filtered through newspaper headlines and diplomatic dinner conversations. Europe was burning by 1940. France had fallen. Britain was being bombed nightly. American newspapers printed photographs of destroyed cities, refugee columns, children evacuated from London. Marjorie read these reports in her Palm Beach drawing room, served breakfast by staff who had polished the silver that morning, surrounded by Russian imperial treasures she had purchased while Stalin was executing millions. She responded the way wealthy Americans responded, through donations. The British War Relief Fund received a check. The American Red Cross received a check. Refugee organizations received checks. Each donation was large enough to merit public acknowledgement, small enough to be completely unnoticed by her overall wealth. She was photographed presenting oversized checks to charity representatives. The photographs appeared in newspapers. She looked concerned and generous. She was both of these things. She was also completely insulated from anything that would require actual sacrifice. Joseph Davies saw opportunity in the war. He had left the Moscow ambassadorship in 1938, but maintained his Soviet connections. In 1941, he published a book about his time in Moscow, Mission to Moscow. The book praised Stalin, defended the show trials, and argued that the Soviet Union was a reliable ally against fascism. The book was astonishingly dishonest. Davies had witnessed the purges and reported them as legitimate justice. He had observed the terror and described it as necessary political reform. The book became a bestseller anyway because Americans in 1941 wanted to believe the Soviet Union could be a partner against Hitler. Marjorie funded the book's promotion. She hosted parties for Davies where he discussed his diplomatic experience. She used her social connections to arrange speaking engagements. She believed in the book because she believed in her husband, and she believed in her husband because acknowledging his dishonesty would require acknowledging that she had funded 3 years of diplomatic work built on delusion. The alternative was too destabilizing, so she promoted the book, attended the speeches, and accepted praise for her husband's expertise on a country neither of them had actually understood. The United States entered the war in December 1941. Marjorie was 54 years old. She had 3 adult daughters, multiple estates, and wealth that made her one of the richest women in America. The war required national mobilization, rationing, production controls, sacrifice. Wealthy Americans were expected to participate visibly. Marjorie offered the Sea Cloud, her 350-foot yacht, to the Navy. The gesture was widely publicized. She was praised for her patriotism. The Navy converted the yacht to a patrol vessel. Marjorie continued living in her estates, attended by full staffs, eating meals that ignored rationing restrictions because wealth purchased exemptions that were never officially acknowledged. The contradictions were everywhere but never examined. Marjorie served on war bond committees, encouraging Americans to purchase bonds that funded the war effort. She appeared at rallies, spoke briefly about sacrifice and national unity, and returned to Mar-a-Lago, where nothing had changed. The estate still required 70 staff. The meals still featured steaks and butter and sugar that rationing had made scarce for everyone else. She was performing patriotism while living in opposition to everything that performance claimed to represent. General Foods profited enormously from the war. The military needed convenient, shelf-stable food products for troops. The company had been manufacturing exactly that for decades. Government contracts arrived in volumes that exceeded anything from the Depression. General Foods expanded production, hired workers, and generated profits that made the pre-war years look modest. Marjorie's dividends increased. She was becoming wealthier from a war that was killing millions. The mechanism was invisible. Government contracts paid to General Foods paid dividends to shareholders included Marjorie. The blood was abstracted into quarterly statements. She hosted war bond rallies at Mar-a-Lago. These were elaborate events, orchestras, speeches by military officials, appearances by movie stars who donated their time. Tickets were expensive. The wealthy came, purchased bonds, congratulated themselves on their contributions, and went home to houses that were unchanged by the war happening across 2 oceans. Marjorie raised millions for war bonds. She never missed a meal, never experienced scarcity, never faced any choice that involved genuine sacrifice. Her contribution was financial, which meant it was completely painless. Adelaide and Eleanor, her older daughters, were in their 30s by 1942. Both had married. Both lived away from their mother, maintaining minimum contact. They had grown up watching Marjorie perform wealth, perform charity, perform motherhood, and they wanted none of it. The war gave them distance that seemed justified. Adelaide's husband was in the military. Eleanor was working for a relief organization. They used these activities as reasons to avoid Mar-a-Lago, to decline invitations, to maintain separation from a mother they found increasingly intolerable. Nadania, Marjorie's youngest daughter, was 19 in 1942. She attended college in New York, far from Palm Beach, far from her mother's suffocating attention. She visited Mar-a-Lago during breaks because refusing would have caused conflict she lacked the courage to initiate. The visits were tense. Marjorie wanted closeness, wanted her daughter to appreciate the wealth and luxury she had provided. Nadania wanted escape. She saw the estates, the staff, the wealth, the performance, and she saw her mother's loneliness, visible despite the 70 servants, despite the crowds at the rallies, despite the constant activity. The loneliness made everything worse. It revealed that all the wealth had purchased nothing except the ability to be alone in increasingly expensive settings. By 1944, the war was clearly won. The invasion of Europe succeeded. Germany was collapsing. Japan was retreating. American casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands. General Foods had supplied millions of rations to troops. Marjorie had donated millions to war bonds and relief funds. She had loaned her yacht to the Navy. She had hosted rallies and spoken about sacrifice. She had done all of this without experiencing a single moment of actual hardship. The war had required nothing from her except money she would never miss. It had increased her wealth through defense contracts. It had provided opportunities for visible patriotism that cost her nothing and earned her praise. The yacht was returned to her in 1945, converted back from patrol vessel to luxury vessel. The Navy thanked her for her service. The service had consisted of allowing them to use something she was not using anyway. She resumed sailing on the Sea Cloud, attended by crew, hosting guests, traveling to the Caribbean and the Mediterranean while Europe rebuilt from rubble and Asia counted its dead. She had participated in the war in the only way available to someone of her wealth, symbolically, financially, and without any connection to its actual cost. Adelaide was 37 in 1945, married to a man who worked in finance and wanted nothing from Marjorie except to be left alone. They had 2 children. They lived in Boston, in a house that was comfortable but deliberately modest compared to Mar-a-Lago or Tregaron, or any of her mother's estates. Adelaide had spent her childhood watching servants raise her, watching her mother chase social acceptance that never arrived, watching wealth fail to solve any problem that mattered. She had decided early that she wanted none of it. The relationship had been cold for years, but 1945 made it visible. Marjorie invited Adelaide and her family to spend Christmas at Mar-a-Lago. Adelaide declined. She gave excuses: her husband's work schedule, the children's school activities, travel difficulties. The excuses were transparent. The real reason was simpler. Adelaide could not stand to be around her mother for more than a few hours. The performance exhausted her. The wealth embarrassed her. The loneliness that radiated from Marjorie despite the staff and the estates and the constant entertaining that made everything unbearable. Marjorie responded by increasing the invitations. She called more frequently. She sent gifts, expensive, impersonal things purchased by secretaries. She wrote letters about how important family was, how rarely they saw each other, how much she missed her grandchildren. The letters went unanswered for weeks. When Adelaide finally responded, the replies were brief, formal, empty of anything except the minimum courtesy required to avoid open conflict. They were communicating like distant acquaintances, not mother and daughter. Eleanor was 36, divorced, living in Manhattan, and working for a foundation that funded educational programs for poor children. The work paid almost nothing. She did it anyway, partly because she believed in it, partly because it represented the opposite of everything her mother stood for. Eleanor had inherited enough money to live comfortably without working. General Foods dividends came to her the same way they came to Marjorie. She donated most of it. She lived in a small apartment, took the subway, and avoided Mar-a-Lago as completely as geography allowed. The divorce had happened in 1943. Marjorie had not attended. Eleanor had not invited her. The marriage had been brief, miserable, and conducted entirely without her mother's input. Eleanor had learned from watching Marjorie's marriages, 3 divorces, 3 transactional partnerships that produced children and wealth transfers, but nothing resembling love. Eleanor had tried something different. She married someone she actually loved, someone without money, someone her mother would have hated. The marriage failed anyway, but it failed for reasons that had nothing to do with money, which felt like progress. Nedaniah was 22 in 1945, recently graduated from college and desperate to escape the weight of being Marjorie Merriweather Post's daughter. She had changed her name to Dina Merrill, kept the surname, dropped the first name that connected her too obviously to her mother. She wanted to be an actress. This was not acceptable. Wealthy young women did not work in theater. They did not pursue careers at all, especially not careers that involved public performance and uncertain income. Dina did not care what was acceptable. She enrolled in acting classes anyway. Marjorie tried to prevent this through financial control. Dina had a trust fund, but Marjorie controlled when distributions happened. She threatened to withhold money if Dina pursued acting. Dina pursued it anyway, working minor jobs to pay for classes, accepting help from friends, living in circumstances that horrified Marjorie. Small apartments, irregular meals, the kind of financial uncertainty that her mother's wealth was supposed to prevent forever. The conflict escalated through 1945 and 1946. Marjorie used money as leverage. Dina used distance as resistance. Neither won. They just established that their relationship was fundamentally a negotiation about control. The three daughters rarely spoke to each other. They had been raised in different houses by different staffs during different phases of Marjorie's life. Adelaide and Eleanor were 15 and 14 years older than Dina. They had nothing in common except the shared experience of having Marjorie as a mother, and that shared experience had taught them different lessons about how to survive it. Adelaide withdrew into middle-class respectability. Eleanor withdrew into work that felt meaningful. Dana withdrew into a career that required her to become someone else entirely. Marjorie could not understand why her daughters did not want to be near her. She had given them everything: education at the best schools, financial security, access to wealth most Americans could not imagine. She had provided. She had funded their lives. She had done what wealthy mothers were supposed to do. The fact that they found her unbearable made no sense to her. She interpreted their distance as ingratitude, as failure to appreciate what she had given them. What she had given them was the experience of being raised by paid staff, while their mother chased social acceptance that never arrived. She had given them the knowledge that wealth solved nothing except the problem of survival. She had given them childhood's inside palaces where they were emotionally alone, surrounded by servants who were polite and distant because they were employees, not family. She had given them a model of womanhood built entirely on acquisition, collecting husbands, collecting houses, collecting art, collecting social connections that remained superficial despite decades of effort. Joseph Davies, Marjorie's third husband, existed in the background of all this family dysfunction. He was 73 in 1955, still married to Marjorie, still living in her estates, still benefiting from her wealth. They maintained separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives. He traveled frequently. She rarely asked where. The marriage had served its purpose. He got his ambassadorship. She got the illusion of partnership with someone politically significant. They had nothing left to offer each other except the convenience of avoiding another divorce. By 1955, Marjorie was 68 years old. Her daughters were estranged in ways that were permanent, even if never formally acknowledged. Adelaide declined invitations with increasing bluntness. Eleanor stopped answering letters. Dina was pursuing acting in New York and Europe, using a stage name, living a life that was deliberately constructed to have nothing to do with serial fortunes or Palm Beach estates. Marjorie had 3 daughters, 8 grandchildren she rarely saw, and decades of wealth that had failed to build any relationship that survived without financial obligation as its foundation. She sat in Mar-a-Lago's drawing room, 70 servants maintaining the estate around her, and wrote letters to daughters who did not respond. She planned family gatherings that no one attended. She offered money to grandchildren who had been taught by their mothers to be suspicious of anything that came with her name attached. She had spent her entire life trying to purchase belonging, from Palm Beach society, from Greenwich society, from her husbands, from her daughters. None of them wanted what she was offering. They wanted distance instead, and distance was the one thing her wealth could not prevent them from achieving. Hillwood, the estate in Washington, became Marjorie's primary residence by 1955. She had purchased the property in 1955, replacing Tregorin, which she sold after deciding it was insufficiently grand. Hillwood was smaller than Mar-a-Lago, only 40 rooms, but the location mattered. Washington was where ambassadors lived, where political power concentrated, where her collection of Russian imperial art would mean something to people who understood diplomatic history. She renovated Hillwood completely, spending 3 years transforming it into a museum that happened to have bedrooms. The Russian collection had grown obsessively since the Moscow years. After leaving the Soviet Union in 1938, Marjorie continued purchasing imperial treasures through dealers in Paris and London. The Soviets were still liquidating the Romanov estates, still selling off the contents of palaces to raise foreign currency. Marjorie bought Fabergé eggs, icons painted in the 15th century, Catherine the Great's dinner service, Nicholas II's porcelain, jeweled chalices from Orthodox churches. She purchased entire rooms from dismantled palaces, wood paneling, chandeliers, furniture, tapestries. She was collecting fragments of a destroyed civilization. The collection filled Hillwood completely. Every room became a display space. The icon room held dozens of religious paintings acquired from churches the Soviets had demolished. The French drawing room featured furniture and porcelain from the imperial collection. The pavilion housed larger pieces, sleighs, carriages, court costumes. Marjorie hired curators, conservators, and catalogers. She employed staff whose only job was maintaining the collection, monitoring temperature and humidity, cleaning the objects, rotating displays, preventing deterioration. She gave tours to visiting diplomats and society figures. These were elaborate affairs. Guests arrived for lunch, examined the collection for hours, listened to Marjorie explain the provenance of each piece. She could recite the history of every Fabergé egg, every icon, every piece of porcelain. She had studied the imperial court obsessively. She knew which pieces had belonged to which Romanov, which had been displayed in which palace, which had survived the revolution, and which had been thought lost until she purchased them from Soviet dealers desperate for American dollars. The tours were performances, and Marjorie was performing for an audience that was not there. She wanted the collection to prove something, that she had taste, that she understood history, that she was more than a serial heiress who inherited wealth. She wanted people to see the collection and recognize her as a serious collector, someone who preserved cultural treasures, someone whose wealth served purposes beyond personal luxury. Some visitors recognized this. Most saw an old woman surrounded by objects that had belonged to dead Russians, objects beautiful and historically significant and utterly disconnected from any coherent purpose except accumulation. The collection was worth millions. It was also completely unusable. The porcelain could not be used for dining. It was too valuable, too fragile. The furniture could not be sat on. The icons were religious objects now displayed as art. Everything in Hillwood was preserved behind glass or rope barriers, maintained at precise temperatures, protected from the deterioration that comes from actual use. Marjorie lived in a house full of objects that existed only to be looked at. She had spent decades and millions of dollars creating a museum where she slept. The obsession extended beyond Russian art. Marjorie collected American colonial furniture, French decorative arts, Chinese porcelain, anything that dealers suggested was rare and valuable. The acquisitions followed no coherent plan. She bought what impressed her, what dealers told her was important, what other collectors wanted. She purchased entire collections. A dealer would offer a set of 50 pieces, and she would buy all 50 rather than selecting the best. The collection grew beyond any possibility of display. Objects were stored in warehouses, in basements, in climate-controlled facilities that she rarely visited. The purchases filled a void that nothing else could fill. Marjorie was 70 years old in 1957. Her daughters avoided her. Her husband was aging and increasingly irrelevant. She had no close friends, only social acquaintances who attended her events because declining would be rude. The collection gave her something to research, something to discuss, something that required her attention and knowledge. Each acquisition was a small victory. She had found something rare, purchased something another collector wanted, added something significant to Hillwood. The victories were hollow, but they were consistent. The collection never rejected her. Joseph Davies died in May 1958. He was 71. The death was sudden, a heart attack at Tregerin, which they still jointly owned despite Marjorie's move to Hillwood. The funeral was well attended by political figures who remembered his ambassadorship and had not read his book carefully enough to recognize its dishonesty. Marjorie wore black, accepted condolences, and felt nothing. They had been married for 23 years and had spent perhaps a dozen of those months in actual proximity. His death changed nothing about her daily life. She continued living at Hillwood, continued expanding the collection, continued giving tours to diplomats who came out of obligation rather than interest. The will revealed that Davies had debts. He had maintained the appearance of wealth while borrowing against expectations of inheriting from Marjorie. She paid the debts without comment. They totaled less than she spent annually on the collection. The revelation should have been humiliating. Her third husband had married her for money, used her wealth to maintain his political career, borrowed against her fortune, and left her to clean up his finances. She seemed not to notice, or she noticed and decided that acknowledging it would be more painful than pretending she had not. She was alone at Hillwood now, truly alone in a way she hadn't been since childhood. No husband, however distant. No children, however estranged. Just Marjorie, 40 staff members, and rooms full of objects that had belonged to people more interesting than she was. She ate dinner alone most evenings, served formal meals in the dining room by staff who set the table for one. She sat surrounded by Catherine the Great's porcelain, Nicholas II's silver, Fabergé eggs that had been Easter gifts to empresses. She was dining with ghosts of Russian aristocracy, and the ghosts were better company than anyone living she could convince to visit. The collecting accelerated after Davies died. Marjorie purchased more aggressively, paid higher prices, competed with museums for acquisitions. She was 71, 72, 73. She was running out of time to complete the collection, though the collection had no completion point. There was always another Fabergé egg, another icon, another piece of imperial porcelain. The dealers knew this. They raised prices. She paid them. The collection was infinite, and so was her willingness to purchase substitutes for everything she could not buy. Acceptance, intimacy, purpose, meaning, connection to another living person who wanted her presence rather than her money. Herbert Arthur May was 72 when he proposed to Marjorie in 1958. He had made his fortune in Pittsburgh steel and food distribution, a practical fortune earned through business rather than inherited. He was a widower. His first wife had died 2 years earlier after a long illness. He had children, grandchildren, a life that was complete and settled. He did not need Marjorie's money. This distinguished him from her previous husbands, though it did not distinguish him enough to matter. They met at a dinner party in Washington. He knew who she was. Everyone in their circles knew who Marjorie Merriweather Post was. She was 71, recently widowed from Joseph Davies, living alone at Hillwood among her Russian treasures. May was charming in the way that elderly, successful men are charming, attentive, complimentary, interested in her collection. He visited Hillwood. He asked intelligent questions about the Fabergé eggs. He did not appear to want anything except companionship. Marjorie had not experienced companionship without transaction in decades. She mistook his courtesy for something deeper. They married in June 1958, less than a month after Davies died. The timing was scandalous in the muted way that scandals among the elderly wealthy are scandalous. People discussed it privately, smiled publicly, and attended the small wedding at Hillwood. May moved into the estate. His children were appalled. They had expected their father to remain a widower, to live quietly, to preserve his late wife's memory through solitude. Instead, he had married the serial heiress 6 weeks after meeting her. The children's objections were not about principle. They were about inheritance. Their father's marriage to someone wealthier than he was complicated their expectations about his estate. The marriage was immediately strange. May had his routines established over 70 years. Marjorie had hers. Neither was willing to adjust. He wanted breakfast at 7. She wanted breakfast at 9. He wanted quiet evenings. She wanted to host dinners for diplomats and give tours of the collection. He found the Russian treasures impressive for approximately 2 weeks, after which they were just expensive objects cluttering every room. She found his disinterest in the collection incomprehensible. How could anyone live at Hillwood and not want to spend hours discussing the provenance of Catherine the Great's porcelain? They argued about small things because arguing about large things would have required acknowledging that the marriage was a mistake. She criticized his breakfast schedule. He criticized her spending on the collection. She wanted him to attend social events with her. He wanted to stay home. They were two elderly people set in decades of habit, trapped in a marriage neither had thought through beyond the immediate appeal of not being alone. The appeal dissolved quickly once they were actually living together. May's health declined through 1959. He had heart problems that worsened with stress, and living at Hillwood was nothing but stress. The staff operated according to Marjorie's preferences. The daily schedule revolved around her needs. The entire estate existed as an extension of her will, and May was expected to adapt to it rather than negotiate about it. He could not adapt. He was not accustomed to being the subordinate spouse. His fortune, while smaller than Marjorie's, was substantial enough that he had never depended on anyone. Now he was living in someone else's house, on someone else's schedule, surrounded by someone else's staff who took orders from someone else. The arguments intensified. They fought about money, though neither needed it. They fought about his children's visits, which Marjorie found intrusive. They fought about her daughter's absence, which May thought she had earned through decades of emotional neglect. They fought about the collection. He thought she was wasting money on objects no one would remember or care about. She thought he was a Philistine who could not appreciate cultural preservation. They were both right. They were also both miserable in a marriage that had lasted less than 2 years and already felt like a life sentence. May had a heart attack in November 1964. He was 78. The attack happened at Hillwood, in the bedroom they had stopped sharing months earlier. Staff found him. Doctors were summoned. He was hospitalized, recovered partially, and returned to Hillwood diminished. He could barely walk. He needed constant medical attention. Marjorie hired nurses, turned one of the estate's rooms into a medical facility, and continued living her life around his deterioration. She visited him daily, briefly, the way one might visit a distant relative out of obligation. He died in March 1964, 5.5 years after they married. The funeral was attended by his children, who had barely spoken to Marjorie during the marriage. They contested the will immediately. May had left Marjorie some money, not a fortune, but enough to be noticed. His children argued he had been unduly influenced, that he had been mentally compromised when he revised his will, that Marjorie had manipulated an elderly widower into marriage for financial gain. The accusation was absurd. Marjorie had more money than she could spend. She did not need May's estate. She fought the challenge anyway, on principle, because conceding would have meant admitting the marriage had been exactly as transactional as his children claimed. The legal battle lasted a year. Eventually the children settled, accepting a compromise that gave Marjorie less than the will promised, but enough that she could claim victory. She never saw them again. The settlement was announced in newspapers. The coverage was brief, buried in back pages, noticed only by people who tracked society scandals. Marjorie Merriweather Post's fourth marriage had ended in a probate fight. It was tawdry, sad, and entirely predictable. She was 77 years old. She had been married 4 times. The first marriage was arranged by her father. The second was a business partnership. The third funded her husband's political ambitions. The fourth was a brief disaster between 2 elderly people who should have known better. She had never been married to anyone who wanted her, rather than what she could provide. She had never been married to anyone she loved in any sense that transcended utility. 4 husbands, 4 divorces, or widowhoods, and at the end of it, she was exactly where she started, alone, wealthy, surrounded by possessions that substituted for connection. She returned to her routine at Hillwood. The collection needed maintenance. Diplomats needed tours. The staff needed supervision. She had filled her life with activities that required her attention without requiring her emotional presence. She could spend entire days managing the estate, corresponding with dealers, planning acquisitions, and never have a conversation that touched on anything real. This was sustainable. This was survivable. This was the life she had built for herself through 4 marriages and 7 decades of wealth, and it would continue unchanged until she physically could not continue it anymore. Marjorie's hands began shaking in 1965. The tremor was slight at first, noticeable only when she held teacups or signed documents. By 1966, it was constant. Doctors called it essential tremor, prescribed medications that did nothing, and suggested she reduce stress. She was 79 years old, living alone in a 40-room mansion filled with imperial Russian treasures, managing multiple estates and overseeing staff numbering close to 100 across her properties. Stress was not something she could reduce. It was the structure of her existence. Her eyesight deteriorated simultaneously. She had worn glasses for years, but now even corrected vision could not help her read the fine print in auction catalogs or examine the details of objects dealers brought for her consideration. She relied increasingly on curators and staff to describe pieces to her. This terrified her in ways she never articulated. The collection had been hers. Her knowledge, her expertise, her one claim to being more than a serial heiress. Now she was dependent on employees to tell her what she was looking at. The power dynamic she had always controlled was reversing. The falls began in 1967. She fell in the icon room at Hillwood, struck her head on a display case, required stitches. She fell again 3 months later on the stairs at Mar-a-Lago. Staff found her unconscious. She spent 2 days in the hospital. Doctors recommended that she use a wheelchair for safety. She refused. Using a wheelchair would mean admitting fragility, admitting that her body was failing in ways that money could not fix. She compromised by accepting a cane, which she used only when staff were watching. Mar-a-Lago became impossible to maintain at the level she demanded. The estate required constant work. The salt air corroded everything. The tropical humidity damaged furniture and paintings. The grounds needed daily attention to prevent jungle from reclaiming the 17 acres. The annual operating costs exceeded $500,000. Marjorie spent perhaps 6 weeks per year there. The rest of the time, 70 staff members maintained an empty palace. This had always been wasteful. It was now becoming financially unstable, even for someone with her wealth. The General Foods dividends continued, but inflation was eroding their value. The fortune that seemed infinite in 1945 felt more constrained by 1968. Marjorie was not poor. She was never going to be poor, but maintaining multiple estates on a fixed income was becoming difficult. She refused to sell anything. The houses, the art collection, the properties. These were evidence of what she had built, proof that her life meant something. Selling would be admission that she had accumulated more than she could sustain, that her wealth had limits she had ignored. Staff began quitting. The work was demanding, and the pay, while adequate, did not compensate for the difficulty of working for someone increasingly unstable. Marjorie had always been exacting, but age made her paranoid. She accused staff of stealing, of damaging pieces in the collection, of failing to maintain standards. The accusations were usually baseless. Staff left anyway. Replacing them became harder. Fewer people wanted to work in service by 1968. The post-war economy offered alternatives. Working as a domestic servant for an elderly woman who accused you of theft was not appealing when factory jobs paid better. Her memory failed in ways that were obvious to everyone except her. She repeated questions. She forgot conversations that had happened hours earlier. She scheduled appointments she did not remember making. Staff adapted by keeping detailed logs, by confirming everything in writing, by treating her instructions as provisional until they were repeated multiple times. This was efficient. It was also devastating. Marjorie had controlled everything for decades. Now her own staff was managing her the way they managed the collection, carefully, protectively, as something that needed preservation. Adelaide visited once in 1968, briefly, reluctantly, because someone told her she should see her mother before it was too late. The visit was excruciating. Marjorie did not remember that they had been estranged. She talked about family plans, about Adelaide bringing the grandchildren for Christmas, about gatherings that were never going to happen. Adelaide left after 2 days, called her sisters, and reported that their mother was deteriorating. None of them visited again. They had spent decades escaping her influence. They were not going to return now just because she was dying slowly. Eleanor sent letters instead of visiting. The letters were brief, formal, empty of emotion. They provided updates about her work, asked perfunctory questions about Marjorie's health, and offered nothing that suggested affection or forgiveness for the childhood Eleanor had endured. Marjorie kept the letters in a desk drawer. She reread them occasionally, trying to find meaning in Eleanor's careful, distant words. There was no meaning. There was only the minimum communication required to avoid complete estrangement. Dinah was acting in films by 1968, using the name Donna Merrill, succeeding in ways that horrified Marjorie. Wealthy women did not work. They certainly did not become actresses. Dina's success represented everything Marjorie had tried to prevent. Her daughter had rejected the life of wealth and privilege, chosen a career, and was thriving without her mother's money or approval. Dina called occasionally, always briefly, always from locations where she was filming. The calls were updates, not conversations. She was informing her mother she still existed. She was not seeking connection. The loneliness was visible to everyone. Staff whispered about it. Marjorie ate dinner alone every night at a table set for one, served by people who were polite and distant because they were employees. She gave tours of the collection to visitors who came less frequently as her age and instability became known. She spent hours in the icon room, surrounded by religious paintings looted from destroyed churches, sitting in silence because there was nothing else to do and no one to do it with. By 1970, Marjorie was 83. The tremor made eating difficult. Her eyesight was failing. She fell regularly despite the cane. Her memory gaps were increasing. Her daughters avoided her. Her staff managed her. She lived in a museum that required constant maintenance and provided no comfort. The collection that was supposed to be her legacy was becoming her cage, too valuable to abandon, too large to maintain, too meaningless to justify the decades she had spent assembling it. She began talking about donation. Hillwood could become a museum. Someone should preserve the collection after she died. But who? The government did not want it. Museums were not interested in another rich woman's personal collection. The pieces were valuable individually, but incoherent as a whole. Russian imperial art mixed with French furniture, mixed with American colonial pieces, mixed with random acquisitions from 50 years of compulsive buying. It was a monument to acquisition without purpose, and no institution wanted to inherit that burden. Marjorie wrote to the National Park Service in 1969. The letter proposed donating Mar-a-Lago to the federal government. The estate would become a retreat for presidents and visiting dignitaries. A winter White House, she suggested. The property included 17 acres, 128 rooms, ocean and lake frontage, furnishings, and art worth millions. She was offering the government a palace. She expected gratitude. The Park Service responded 6 months later. They declined. The letter was polite, bureaucratic, devastating. The operating costs were prohibitive. The estate required 70 full-time staff. Annual maintenance exceeded $500,000. The government could not justify spending that much on a single property when parks across the country needed funding. They thanked her for her generosity. They suggested she consider other options. They rejected her. She tried again in 1970, this time offering Mar-a-Lago to the state of Florida. Perhaps a governor's residence, she proposed. Perhaps a museum. Perhaps something that would preserve the estate and her name together. Florida responded more quickly than the federal government. They declined within 3 months. Same reasons: operating costs, maintenance requirements, staff needs. The state had universities that needed funding, schools that needed repair, programs that served millions. They could not justify maintaining a Palm Beach palace for the benefit of tourists who might never come. The rejection should not have surprised her. Mar-a-Lago was built to solve a problem that no longer existed: her need to prove she belonged in Palm Beach society. The society had rejected her when the house was new. Now the house was 40 years old, outdated, expensive, and designed for a lifestyle that was disappearing. Wealthy families were not building estates with 70 servants anymore. They were buying apartments in cities, smaller houses that did not require full-time staff. Mar-a-Lago was a monument to excess from an era that was ending. She offered Hillwood next. In 1971, she proposed donating the Washington estate and its collection to the Smithsonian. The Russian imperial treasures alone were worth tens of millions. The Fabergé eggs, the icons, the porcelain. These were museum-quality pieces. The Smithsonian already had Russian art, but nothing at this scale. Marjorie waited for their response. She expected acceptance. The Smithsonian had accepted every major collection offered to it. They would accept hers? They did not. The Smithsonian declined through a carefully worded letter that praised the collection's significance while explaining why they could not accept it. The collection was too personal, too specific to Marjorie's tastes, too incoherent to integrate into their existing Russian holdings. The estate itself was too expensive to maintain. They lacked funding for another house museum. They suggested she establish an independent foundation, hire her own staff, and maintain Hillwood herself, while designating it for eventual public access after her death. The suggestion was reasonable and completely missed the point. Marjorie did not want to maintain Hillwood herself. She was 84 years old. She was dying, slowly, obviously. She wanted someone else to accept responsibility for what she had built. She wanted validation that the collection mattered, that her decades of acquisition had produced something worth preserving. The Smithsonian's refusal meant that experts had evaluated her life's work and found it insufficient. She tried the State Department next. Perhaps Hillwood could house visiting diplomats. Perhaps the Russian collection could facilitate cultural exchange. Perhaps the government needed a facility for entertaining foreign dignitaries. The State Department response was brief. They had facilities. They did not need a house museum in Northwest Washington. They thanked her and declined. By 1972, Marjorie had offered her two major estates to the federal government, two state governments, the Smithsonian and the State Department. Everyone had refused. The operating costs were too high. The locations were wrong. The collections were too personal. The reasons varied, but the message was consistent. No one wanted what she had spent decades building. Her wealth had purchased houses and art, but it had not purchased legacy. The institutions that granted immortality to donors, museums, universities, government agencies, had evaluated her offerings and found them burdensome rather than valuable. She stopped offering. The estates would remain hers until she died, and then her lawyers would deal with the problem. She did not care anymore. The rejection was total. Palm Beach society had rejected her socially. Her daughters had rejected her personally. Now the institutions that preserved wealthy people's legacies were rejecting her philanthropic offerings. She had spent 85 years trying to purchase acceptance through wealth, and at the end everyone was refusing the money. The irony was lost on her, or perhaps it was too painful to acknowledge. She had built Mar-a-Lago to prove she belonged in Palm Beach. No one had wanted her then. Now she was trying to give it away, and no one wanted it now either. The house existed as perfect evidence of wealth's failure. $7 million spent solving a problem that could not be solved with money, and now even giving it away for free was impossible because the burden of maintaining it exceeded any possible benefit. Hillwood was different, but the result was the same. She had assembled the collection to prove she was serious, knowledgeable, important beyond her inherited fortune. The Smithsonian had evaluated the collection and determined it was not important enough to integrate into their holdings. Museums preserved what mattered. Marjorie's collection did not matter. It was expensive, beautiful, historically significant, and ultimately just one rich woman's personal obsession, impressive as individual objects, meaningless as a whole. She spent 1972 watching the estates deteriorate around her. Staff continued quitting. Maintenance fell behind schedule. The gardens grew wild. Rooms that had been opened for tours were closed to save money. The collection she could no longer see clearly gathered dust behind glass cases. Mar-a-Lago sat mostly empty, costing $500,000 per year to maintain for the few weeks she spent there. She was trapped inside palaces no one wanted, surrounded by treasures no institution would accept, living proof that you could spend a fortune building monuments to yourself and still die unmourned by anyone except employees who were paid to care. The rejection had a finality that nothing else in her life had achieved. Her marriages ended, but she remarried. Her daughters left, but she could imagine reconciliation. The social exclusion hurt, but she could pretend it was their loss. The institutional rejection was different. These were experts, evaluating her legacy professionally, and their professional judgment was that what she built was not worth preserving. No amount of money could change that verdict. She had finally found something wealth could not purchase, and it was the one thing she wanted most, proof that her life meant something beyond accumulation. Margaret O'Brien had worked at Hillwood for 23 years by 1972. She started as a housemaid in 1949, was promoted to head housekeeper in 1958, and by 1972 was essentially managing the entire household staff. She was 60 years old. She had spent more time with Marjorie than any of Marjorie's three daughters. She knew Marjorie's routines, her preferences, her deteriorating health, her increasing dependence on people she paid to stay near her. Margaret did not particularly like Marjorie. This was not unusual. Most of the staff who remained did so because they needed employment, not because they felt affection for their employer. Marjorie was demanding, forgetful, sometimes cruel in the casual way that very wealthy people are cruel to servants, expecting perfection while barely acknowledging competence, noticing only failures, treating staff as extensions of her will rather than as humans with their own lives. Margaret endured this because the pay was adequate, and finding another job at 60 would be difficult. The routine at Hillwood was rigid. Marjorie woke at 8. Breakfast was served in her bedroom at 8:30. Tea, toast, fruit arranged on porcelain that had belonged to Russian empresses. She dressed with assistance from a maid who had learned not to comment on how long the process took. By 10, Marjorie was in the icon room or the library, examining pieces in the collection she could no longer see clearly. running her shaking hands over objects she had purchased decades earlier. Lunch at noon, a nap, afternoon correspondence, dinner at 7, alone at a table set for 1, bed by 9. The staff worked around her the way museum staff work around exhibits. She was fragile, valuable in the sense that she paid their salaries and required constant attention to prevent damage. When she fell, and she fell frequently despite the cane, someone was always nearby to help her up, check for injuries, call doctors if necessary. When she forgot where she was or what day it was, someone redirected her gently back to reality. When she accused staff of stealing, which happened regularly, everyone pretended to investigate while knowing the accusations were paranoid delusions. Thomas Fletcher had been Marjorie's driver since 1951. He was 65 in 1972, too old to be driving but still employed because Marjorie insisted on the same staff she had always had. He drove her to appointments she forgot she had made. He waited for hours while she toured rooms in her own house, showing visitors who came less and less frequently the Russian treasures she could barely see. He drove her to Mar-a-Lago for the winter season, a journey that took 2 days and required overnight stops at hotels where Marjorie demanded accommodations, no longer available in 1972. Fletcher knew things about Marjorie that her daughters did not know. He knew she cried sometimes in the back of the car when she thought he could not see. He knew she talked to herself, long conversations with people who were not there, her father, her second husband, sometimes her daughters as children. He knew she was terrified of dying alone, that she asked staff to check on her multiple times each night, that she slept poorly and woke disoriented and needed reassurance that she was still at Hillwood, still alive, still the owner of all this. The remaining staff developed a kind of grim solidarity. They were caring for someone who had never cared for anyone, managing someone who had spent her life managing others, providing companionship to someone incapable of friendship. They did this for money, but also because quitting would have felt like abandoning an elderly woman who had no one else. Her daughters would not come. Her friends, if she had ever had friends, were dead or similarly isolated in their own estates. The staff were the only humans who saw her daily, who knew the reality of her decline, who would witness whatever happened at the end. Mealtimes were the worst. Marjorie insisted on formal dinners, served in the dining room, even though she ate alone. The table was set with imperial Russian china. The meal was served in courses. Staff stood at attention, serving food to a single elderly woman who could barely hold her fork because of the tremor. She ate slowly, sometimes forgetting she was eating, staring at the paintings on the walls, or at nothing. The staff cleared each course, brought the next one, and maintained the fiction that this was normal, that serving elaborate dinners to one person in a 40-room mansion made sense. Margaret noticed Marjorie talking to the portraits. The icon room had paintings of saints, Russian nobility, religious figures. Marjorie would sit there for hours, speaking to them as if they could hear her. Sometimes she asked them questions. Sometimes she told them about her day. Sometimes she apologized. For what? Margaret never understood. The conversations were one-sided, quiet, and deeply sad. Margaret mentioned this to Fletcher once. He said he had noticed the same thing. They agreed not to discuss it with other staff. Some indignities were too private to share, even when you were being paid to witness them. The falls increased through 1972 and into 1973. Marjorie fell in the bathroom in January. She fell on the stairs in March. She fell in the icon room in May, struck her head again, bled onto the carpet that had been imported from a Russian palace. Each fall resulted in new protocols. Staff assigned to follow her, furniture rearranged to create clear pathways, rugs removed to prevent tripping. The house that had been designed to display wealth was being modified to prevent its owner from dying inside it. By summer 1973, Marjorie could not walk unassisted. She used a wheelchair finally because the alternative was remaining in bed. Staff pushed her through Hillwood's rooms, past the collections she had assembled, the furniture she had imported, the art she had purchased from dealers across Europe. She could barely see any of it. She touched objects occasionally, running her shaking hands over porcelain and wood, remembering when she had purchased them, remembering when her hands were steady, remembering when she believed the collection meant something. The staff knew she was dying. They had seen enough elderly wealthy people die to recognize the signs, the increasing falls, the memory loss, the retreat into conversation with people who were not there. The questions about whether she had been good, whether her life mattered, whether anyone would remember her. The staff could not answer these questions honestly. They could only say what they were paid to say. That yes, of course, the collection was magnificent. The estates were beautiful. Her legacy was secure. They said these things while watching an 86-year-old woman die slowly in a museum she had built to house objects that would outlive her by centuries and mean nothing to anyone except as beautiful things that once belonged to someone else. Marjorie stopped leaving her bedroom at Hillwood in August 1973. She was 86 years old. The effort of getting dressed, of moving through the house, of maintaining the routines that had structured her days, all of it became impossible. Staff converted the bedroom into a medical facility. Nurses were hired for round-the-clock care. Doctors visited daily. The bedroom had windows overlooking the gardens, but Marjorie could barely see them. She lay in bed surrounded by furniture she had purchased decades earlier, in a house filled with treasures she could no longer examine, waited on by staff who were professionals at caring for dying wealthy people. Her daughters were notified. Adelaide was in Boston. Eleanor was in Manhattan. Dinah was filming in Europe. The message sent to each was identical. Their mother was declining. They should come if they wanted to see her before the end. Adelaide arrived first, 2 days after the notification. She stayed in one of Hillwood's guest rooms, visited her mother twice daily for exactly 15 minutes, and spent the rest of her time reviewing documents with lawyers. She was there to ensure the estate was managed properly, not to reconcile with a woman she had avoided for 30 years. Eleanor came 3 days later. She stayed at a hotel rather than at Hillwood. She found the estate unbearable. The staff, the formality, the collection that her mother had prioritized over everything else, including her children. Eleanor visited once, sat beside Marjorie's bed for 20 minutes, and left. Marjorie was barely conscious. Eleanor was not sure her mother recognized her. They had not spoken meaningfully in years. There was nothing to say now that would change anything that had happened before. Dinah did not come. She sent a telegram saying she could not leave the film production. The telegram was formal, brief, and entirely unsurprising. She was 49 years old, had spent decades escaping her mother's influence, and was not going to return now to watch her die. Adelaide and Eleanor were angry about this, then realized they were angry because they had come out of obligation and resented that Dinah had refused to feel the same obligation. None of them wanted to be there. Dinah was the only one honest enough to act accordingly. Marjorie drifted in and out of consciousness through late August and early September. When she was conscious, she sometimes did not know where she was. She asked for her father, who had been dead for 59 years. She asked staff to prepare Mar-a-Lago for guests she had invited to parties that existed only in her failing memory. She talked about the collection, gave instructions for maintaining pieces that staff had been maintaining for decades, worried about temperature control and conservation, as if these were urgent concerns rather than routines that would continue after she was gone. The lawyers came frequently. There were documents to sign, final arrangements to confirm, estate details that required her approval. Marjorie signed what they put in front of her. Her signature was illegible, more tremor than letters, but it was legally sufficient. The estate was enormous. Properties, investments, the collection, general food stock that had continued generating dividends through all the decades of her decline. The lawyers ensured everything was documented. They were efficient and emotionless and utterly uninterested in Marjorie as anything except a legal entity whose assets needed proper distribution. Adelaide and Eleanor fought about the collection. Neither wanted it. The objects were valuable but burdensome, requiring maintenance and insurance and climate control. But they fought about it anyway because fighting about objects was easier than acknowledging that their mother had spent her entire life accumulating things as a substitute for relationships. And now those things were all that remained. The lawyers mediated. Solutions were proposed. Nothing was resolved while Marjorie was still alive because resolving it would require admitting she was going to die, and maintaining polite fictions was what wealthy families did best. Margaret O'Brien and the other staff continued their routines. They maintained the house, prepared meals no one ate, gave tours to no one, and waited for the end. They had done this before with other elderly employers. The pattern was always the same. Family appeared at the end, fought about inheritance, disappeared again after the funeral. The staff would remain until the estate was sold or donated or converted into something else, and then they would find new positions with other wealthy families and repeat the process. September continued. Marjorie weakened. She stopped eating solid food. She spoke less, and when she spoke it was mostly incoherent. Fragments of Russian learned in Moscow, French from her childhood education, accusations that people were stealing from her, questions about whether the collections were safe. The nurses administered morphine for pain. The doctors confirmed she was dying, and there was nothing to do except make her comfortable, which was medical language for acknowledging that money could not prevent death any more than it had prevented loneliness. She died on September 12, 1973, at approximately 3 in the morning. A nurse was present. Adelaide and Eleanor were asleep in other parts of the house. They were notified at 6. The death was expected, peaceful, and utterly without drama. Marjorie Merriweather Post stopped breathing in a bedroom at Hillwood, surrounded by staff who barely knew her, in a house filled with objects she could no longer see, having spent 86 years trying to purchase things that were never for sale. The funeral was held 4 days later at the National Cathedral in Washington. Attendance was modest, approximately 200 people, mostly business associates, society figures who came out of obligation, staff who were given time off to attend. Adelaide, Eleanor, and Dina sat in the front row, 3 daughters who had spent most of their adult lives avoiding their mother, now assembled for the final performance. The service was Episcopalian, traditional, expensive, and emotionally empty. The eulogy praised Marjorie's philanthropy, her collection, her role in preserving Russian cultural treasures. It did not mention that she had spent her life lonely, or that her marriages were transactional, or that her daughters barely knew her. The estate settled into probate immediately. Lawyers filed paperwork. Assets were inventoried. The collection was appraised, worth over $50 million, more than enough to create the museum Marjorie had wanted, but no institution had agreed to accept. Adelaide and Eleanor established a foundation to maintain Hillwood as a museum, primarily because disposing of the collection would have been more complicated than preserving it. The museum opened to the public in 1977. Visitors came to see the Fabergé eggs, the imperial porcelain, the Russian icons. They learned nothing about Marjorie except that she was wealthy and had good taste. Her actual life, the loneliness, the social rejection, the failed marriages, the estranged children, was not mentioned. The museum preserved the objects. It erased the woman. Mar-a-Lago sold in 1985 to a real estate developer for $8 million. He converted it into a private club. The ballrooms where Marjorie once hosted 500 guests now host weddings for strangers. Her bedroom became hotel suites. The estate she built to force acceptance became a business, her name removed from the property entirely. What she spent $7 million constructing in 1927 exists still, but she does not exist within it. Hillwood opened as a museum in 1977. Visitors tour the rooms she arranged, examine the Fabergé eggs and imperial porcelain, and learn about Russian decorative arts. The museum materials mention her briefly: heiress, collector, philanthropist. They do not mention the 4 marriages, the daughters who avoided her, the decades she spent trying to purchase belonging from people who would not sell it. The objects remain. The woman who collected them has been carefully edited out. General Foods merged with Kraft in 1989. The Postum cereal company her father built, the source of everything, disappeared into a larger corporate structure. Post cereals still exist, manufactured by companies with no connection to her family. The fortune continues generating profits. The system persists, indifferent. Her 3 daughters lived into their 80s and 90s. They rarely discussed their mother. When asked, they spoke carefully, briefly, about duty rather than affection. They had survived her wealth. That seemed to be enough. The estates, the collection, the fortune, all of it outlived her and continued without her, which was perhaps the point she never understood. Wealth does not need the people who accumulate it. It simply moves to the next custodian. She spent 86 years trying to make her fortune mean something beyond its dollar value, trying to transform inheritance into legacy, trying to purchase permanence. What she purchased instead was a museum that preserves objects while erasing their collector, and an estate that exists with her name removed, and daughters who survived by leaving, and decades of proof that certain things, Acceptance, intimacy, meaning remain unpurchasable regardless of how much you spend attempting to buy them. Whether she understood this at the end, or whether she died still believing the problem was insufficient spending rather than the category error of thinking these things were for sale at all, remains unanswered.